This is an explanation of the Bat and Bugs game, and specifically I want to talk about collision detection and variables. As we've seen in this game, using the arrow keys, you can move the bat around, and if you get the bat's mouth to line up with the mosquito, the mosquito disappears, comes up somewhere somewhat random, and the number of mosquitoes eaten in the top there increases. And that's really all there is to it. So if we take a look at the code for this, I'll just quickly run through what happens here. So the first thing that happens, and this block of code could really go in here if we wanted to, and get rid of that, is when we start, this is the script for the bat, and it basically sets the bat to go to a specific location on the screen with the X value of -120 and the Y value of 0. And again, just as a quick reminder of that, if you want, this is always helpful when you're building something. Change your backdrop and go to the XY grid. And now we can see the positioning on the screen of where everything is located. And if I hit the green arrow, and I'll just stop it, you can see that the center of this bat, sort of measured from the top to bottom in here, is at -120, and the Y position, the up down, is at 0, right on the orange line. Next we have our familiar loop where we're checking to see if the user is pressing any keys. Again, this loop is running hundreds of times per second perhaps. Now it might not seem like that on screen because the computer does take time to refresh the screen, but if we created a loop and all it did was counted a number up, it would be going thousands and thousands of times per second. And we have this loop. I'm just going to quickly explain this, where we change the X position by 6 if the right arrow is pressed, which is increasing every time it detects that. It's going to basically be moving the bat to the right. And we point the bat to 90, which is pointing right. So you can see that. And this is helpful when you're working on your program. If something doesn't seem to be working, you can drag these blocks out individually and change them and see what happens, and that's what the bat does. So left and right, we move it left and right and change the direction. When we move the bat up and down, we don't change its direction. The bat sort of stays horizontal. So that's all that's going on here. This loop here, all we're doing is changing costumes on the bat. Remember, we have 2 costumes. Costume 1 with the wings up, costume 2 with the wings down. And it waits for 0.15 seconds and it just switches between them. And I just came up with that number by trying different numbers out of something that seemed like a realistic for the purpose of a game, how a bat's wings might go up and down. So that's everything that is happening with the bat. Where there's some interesting things going on with the mosquito is here. Now this is, you can see here, there's not a lot of code here. Let me just take this apart here. We have, actually let me do something first here. Just in case I wreck this, I'm going to make a copy of it, and I'll separate it from the arrow being pressed, and we'll just keep that over here for now, and then we can have that if needed. So we've got the orange code here, which is managing our variable. So a variable is just a place in computer memory where you can store information. They are an absolutely essential part of computer programming. In addition to loops like this forever loop and decisions like this decision if something is touching, variables, those three things are really the core elements of programming, and then everything else you're going to be combining those in different ways to make your programs. I'll just take out this little bit of code, and we can go to data, and it's always helpful. You can use this checkbox to show your variables on the screen when your program is running. In this case, it's actually part of the game to show your score. But in other cases, when you're using variables, you won't want to show them. You'll use them in your code, but you don't need them on the screen. But when your program isn't working how you want it to work, it's always a good idea to come and display your variables on the screen, and play your game and see what things are at, where, what numbers or what words are in your variables, and that will help you solve any bugs that you find. But I can take that out and I can play this game. Okay, and the code is still doing the same thing as before, except it's just not keeping track of how many bugs I'm eating. So that's kind of a little more boring, I guess. What's happening here, though, is it's basically saying show the mosquito. Again, this is just to make sure that people can see it. Set the size to 70%. If you look at my costumes, my mosquito picture is actually bigger than this mosquito on the stage. So I've just used code to make it a bit smaller. And then I say, just like we did with the bat, we set it to a particular position on the screen. This one, I didn't want it to always go to the same place, and so I used an operator here. So in order to build this, go to X is pick random from -200 to +200 and Y of 100. I did the same thing we've done before. I dragged in a go to XY motion block, and then I went into operators, and there's one built in called pick random. And I said pick a random number from -200 to +200. And now I've always set the Y to 100, so if you watch when the game starts, as of right now, it's always going to start at 100. Which it's a little bit hard to see. This, I'm not sure in this video, the screen is a little bit, it's not capturing every frame of the game, so it might not look like it, but they're all starting in this general line here. We could have just as easily chosen to make the Y value random. The reason I chose -200 to 200 is because the X dimension goes to 240. -240, so I wanted it to come somewhere between where I have the mouse here and where I have the mouse here. And that was just a personal decision because it's my program. I could have made Y more random by doing something like this. Instead, I want to go between -100 and +120. And I could restart my program. And you can see that my mosquito is starting in different places. Now it's starting down in this area. Then I go into a loop, and what's happening here is the mosquito is constantly moving. Every time through the loop, I move it 5 steps, and then I make it turn. And again, this turn is just a certain number of degrees. Remember, there's 360 degrees in a circle. And to get some random movement, I just said every time pick a random number between -20 and 20 degrees. the reason I chose this range is I didn't want to pick a huge range, like from negative 180 to positive 180, because then, why don't we just try that? If I say negative 180 to positive 180, I didn't think the movement would look as good, because it was trying to be going all over the place. And so you can see there it's really random, and it doesn't really seem to be getting anywhere. By only going from negative 20 to positive 20, the mosquito sort of stays on course a bit better. It can only turn a small portion of a turn. And then there's this built-in function block called if it's on the edge bounce, and we can talk a bit about that more, but basically once it runs into the edge, it just bounces off, just like if you shot a pool ball and it hit at a certain angle, it would bounce off at the opposite angle. So that's the random motion. And then this section is our collision detection. And I'll take this out for a moment. So collision detection, like we've talked about, is just determining if one thing on the screen is touching another thing. So I've done the touching of a color in this example, but I'm just going to grab this one here just to show you. You can choose if it's touching a different item. So we could say if it's touching the mouse, if it's touching the edge, and we could build our own bouncing routine, or my bat. And if I had more sprites in this program, I'd have more items in this list. So I'm going to change it to just say if it's touching the bat. And I'm going to put this back to 100. Oops. And you'll see that my game is now suddenly a lot easier, because it just looks to see if it's touching the bat, which has made a boring game even more boring. Let me just go here. I'm just going to take that grid off. So what's going on here is when it's touching the bat, play the pop sound, which is the pop sound we keep hearing. And then I'm basically just moving the bug away. And again, I'm going to Y180. I'm trying to get it up somewhere near the top. Basically so it looks like it's flying back onto the screen, because remember that this goes up, this is 180 is the top line. And then I pick a random number from negative 200 to 200, so it should look like a mosquito's flying onto the screen. So even though when I was playing this game, it looks like we're eating a whole bunch of different mosquitoes, we're actually just eating the same mosquito sprite every time. And so it's in an if statement. So the mosquito always moves, but if it's touching the bat, we play the sound and we go somewhere else. Now, what I did to make the game a little more challenging, instead of just touching the bat, I used this touching color. And I went into my bat, and if we look at my bat, I took, I chose a color, I think it's this one here, and I drew a small portion on its mouth. And I did the same thing on this version. This one's a little bit bigger. And I just did that to create a little section that would be where you can eat the mosquito. Okay, and then on the mosquito, I've just said if it's touching this color, that's that same color, then treat it as if it's sort of been eaten. That's really all there is to it for this very simple collision detection here. Okay, so that covers off the random motion and the collision detection. The last piece is creating this variable. Like I said, a variable is a place in the computer memory to store information, and they're really essential to programming. So the way that you create a variable is you go to Data and you click on Make a Variable. And you can call it anything you like. Sample variable. And you can say that you can define if only this mosquito is aware of this variable. So sometimes you can create variables that are only used for particular parts of your program or for the whole program. We'll talk a little bit more about that in our class because there are reasons for choosing that. And a newer thing in Scratch is you can create a cloud variable which they store on the server, so that if you have two different people playing the same game, you can share information between the two versions. So that would mean like one person is on one computer logged into Scratch and playing a game. Somebody else is on an entirely different computer logged into Scratch and playing a game. You can share information between those two players. So I could create my sample variable. By default, it's showing on the screen with this checkbox. Okay. And when you create a variable, you have these options of setting them, which is assigning a value. You can change the value by a certain number. You can show them in your code and hide them in your code. So even though I've got this checked off here, if we wanted to, when we start the program, I could say hide my sample variable, and when I start the program, it's hidden. Okay, so let me just take that one out of there. And so again, at the start of the game, we want to set, we'll use my new variable, whoops, sample variable. We want to set it to 0 so that it doesn't have any other value in there. And then when we catch a bug, a mosquito in the mouth of the bat, we can increase it by 1. We can increase it by any number we want, and this doesn't have to be a number. It could be, we could even do this if we wanted. We could say pick a random number. Let's say between 1 and 250. And I want to show it, and I'll just, it's always safer to do this and say show, just in case you move something off your screen. And now it gave me 212 as my random number. And it gave me 4 that time to go from 212 to 216. And so there's a fairly straightforward use of a variable in a game. So I'll just take this and get rid of that and set this back, so that if you do want to copy the code, you can come to the project page and then do a remix, and you can have access to all of this. And if you have a variable in your program and you don't want it anymore, so I'll go back here, you can right click on it and delete it. I'll take this out of here and we'll leave this program how it was. So hopefully that's helped you get a bit of an understanding, reinforcing movement, having a costume change, using variables, doing collision detection, and then lastly, I know some people had asked about doing some random motion. So here is simply these 2 lines here. It's really just this one line that is making the mosquito move randomly. Thanks, I hope you find this helpful.